Good evening, all, and welcome back to Ethics. Tonight we are going to be discussing Blessed Augustine of Hippo as well as Thomas Aquinas. So let's jump right in. Augustus Aurelius Augustinus Hipponensis, as his full name was, is circa 354 to 430 AD. He's in Carthage, North Africa, which today is kind of Tunisia, Morocco, Libya, that sort of area. And so we have jumped basically 800 years from last week. So between Aristotle and Augustine, there's an 800-year gap. And Augustine is what we're going to call a Neoplatonist, which means he's going to use the philosophy and thought of Plato to kind of further his own thought and philosophy as well. Our key concepts for Augustine, the first one is the good, which of course we have seen versions of from Socrates, from Plato, from Aristotle. Now, this definition of the good is going to change a little bit. Augustine believes that following God is the chief good, and that happiness consists in loving and enjoying that good. His other thought that he's really mainly famous for is his notion of evil. He says, look, evil is not a positive force in the world, but simply the absence of good. So imagine like in physics where you've got a definition of cold. There really isn't anything such as cold in physics. There's just or rather in thermodynamics, there's just an absence of heat. So let's say we've got a hot object, we'll call it the sun. The further that we move away from that object, the colder we're going to perceive ourselves to be. So the further we move away from the source of virtue, that is God, the more vicious we become. We become evil, in other words. So some general notes on him. He's really the first guy where we start to get the idea of original sin, the notion that in addition to the sins that we ourselves commit, we're also tainted by the sin of Adam and Eve. And that's going to be very, very influential in Western theology, Western Christianity, not so much in Eastern versions of it. In fact, Augustine is going to be the foundation of almost all subsequent Western Christianity theology and philosophy. His religious beliefs obviously are going to shape his philosophical thought. He's revered as a saint, certainly in Roman Catholicism, to a great extent in Protestantism. In Eastern Orthodoxy, it kind of depends on who you ask. So that's why he's Blessed Augustine of Hippo rather than Saint Augustine of Hippo. But it's just kind of a pick your poison sort of thing. Now, if we look at his Confessions, which is another book in addition to Plato's Republic, put it on your bucket list, read it before you die. You'll be better for having done so. It's the Western world's first autobiography, in a sense. He tells us that, look, I've been a sinner since the day I was born, that humans are all born with this radical selfishness, something I think I'm inclined to believe he is right on, and something that Thomas Hobbes, who we are discussing next week, would certainly agree with him on. But he says, despite the fact that we sin our entire lives, we're not made to sin. We're made to praise God, and we really can't find peace in our lives until we start doing so. So we've got to turn away from ourselves and turn towards God. And so how are we going to do that? So he kind of starts off like Aristotle, even though he's a Platonist, and says, what is the highest good of human life? What's that eudaimonia stuff, which we've seen translated as happiness, completion, perfection, fulfillment, flourishing, satisfaction. And he says, it can't be the body, for the same reason that Aristotle said that, because, the body deteriorates and so on. It's got to be an attribute of the soul. And when he says soul, he means, well, he kind of means soul in the Greek sense, that is to say mind, but he's starting to also think of soul in the Latin sense, which is soul like we might think of it. So whatever that good is going to be a virtue that the soul attains through seeking and following God. But we run into a big Christian question. If God created the universe and everything in it, and is both omnipotent or all-powerful and perfect, why does evil exist? Why do little kids get cancer? Why do hurricanes destroy entire towns? Why did Jersey Shore get like 8 seasons and Firefly only had 1? That is evil, okay? So we've got answers to this question as to why evil exists. The answers themselves are called theodicies. Augustine's isn't necessarily a convincing one, but we'll go through it anyway. By the way, when we're talking about God, God is going to be described by ethical monotheists. Those are people who say there's only one God and that God is basically good. So that would be like Jews, Christians, Muslims, to some extent Zoroastrians, as having these following attributes. So God is omnipotent. God can do absolutely anything. God is omnipresent. God is everywhere all at once, even in Detroit. God is omniscient. knows everything that can be known, including what you did last summer. God is omnibenevolent. That is, God is possessed of infinite goodness. Sometimes this is called providential, God provides, or also omniperfect, all perfect. Okay. So here's where Augustine takes us. He says, God created all things and made them all good, but evil is a corruption or degradation of being, like a hole in a shirt, rot in a tree, disease in a body, blindness in an eye. And so there's really not so much of this stuff naturally occurring. In fact, none of it is. Evil, he says, originates from our free will. Will is this volitional power of force. So volition comes from the same root word as our word volunteer. We have to choose to do it. So for Augustine, every act of the will is an act of love. We're loving something. Love wants to be united to some good. And free will means freedom from external coercion. Basically, nobody outside of me is making me do this, therefore I'm not coerced. It's not necessarily, though, autonomy from God. Autonomy comes from the Greek words autonomos, self, and law, so self-guided, self-governed, self-ruled. It's not autonomy or freedom from God, because God is our ultimate and innermost good. So for Augustine, kind of like Plato, and then later on earlier St. Paul, true freedom means the freedom to love that which will ultimately make us happy. So for Augustine, all sin is really kind of a form of bondage. It's enslavement to this stuff, whatever it is that you're particularly hooked on, whatever your vice is. So sin stems from a defect in our free will, kind of like blindness stems from a defect in our eyes. So because of this corrupted nature, and again, he kind of goes back to the Adam and Eve story. If you're unfamiliar with the story, you can go and read Genesis somewhere online or at home. Because of this corrupted nature, we find it impossible to not sin. We try to be good, but we still end up sinning. We still have free will, but our free will is too corrupted. That is, it's too weak, it's too diseased to be entirely free from sin. Now, in addition to this, we're of course guilty of committing our own actual sins on top of this. And the only thing that opposes this is grace. So grace is this interconnection with God, just as our original sin is an interconnection with Adam. Merit is based on grace, not the other way around, and grace is just something that God gives us because he wants to. So the first thing I ask you to read tonight is called On the Morals of the Catholic Church. Predominantly, this is an anti-Manichaean work, and Manichaeanism is the most influential religion that you've probably never heard of. If you have heard of it, by all means, put something down in the comments, let me know. Basically, this is a Persian religion originally, so modern day Iran, and it kind of builds off of Zoroastrianism. So this guy named Mani comes along and goes, look, Adam, Zoroaster, the Buddha, Jesus, whomever you want to name, they had partial truths, but I've got the whole truth. So Augustine follows this religion for a little while, and then he converts, and it was good timing on his part because the Roman Emperor Theodosius I said, look, next year, if you're still Manichaeans, we're going to kill all you. So massive conversions at this time. But a lot of the stuff from Manichaeanism, he brings with him. So ideas like good and evil, the idea of hell, which is not really a biblical concept, the separation of groups into the elect, hearers, and sinners, that's something that John Calvin, one of the Swiss reformers, would really run with several hundred years after this, and the hostility of the flesh and sexual activity. Manichaeans were a celibate order, so it's kind of hard to make little more Manichaeans, except by conversion. So this is Augustine's breakup letter with Mani. He says, you know, not only are we done, but I'm going to start going on the attack. And so the first assertion that he makes in this is happiness is the enjoyment of man's chief good. And we're going to place two conditions on it. First, nothing can be better than it. And second, it cannot be lost against our will. Okay. So how do we find this? Our chief good can't be anything inferior to us. So if I love double cheeseburgers, and I do, that can't be my chief good. I mean, I could have a lot of them, I could still enjoy them, but it really can't be the highest and best thing to look up to. Because, well, it just can't be, says Augustine. And it also can't be something that's lost against a will. So if I want to keep it, I get to keep it, even if someone tries to take it from me. So we've got to figure out what's better than us, and we've got to figure out what we are. So Augustine asks, are we body and soul? Are we just body? Are we just soul? And by soul, do we mean that we're just mind? So whatever's the chief good of both, it's got to be our highest and best good. So he tells us the chief good of the body is not bodily pleasure, for instance, for the same reasons that we saw with Aristotle, where, you know, you can lose that stuff. It's not an absence of pain. And there he seems to kind of be replying to the Epicureans, a group of philosophers that we didn't have time to discuss, who basically describe pleasure in negative terms. How are you feeling? Well, I'm not hurting today, which is really kind of odd. It's not strength, it's not beauty, it's not swiftness. It's nothing among the goods of the body except the soul, but the soul isn't as far as we can go either. So what he's going to tell us is that whatever perfects the soul is really kind of what we're after. And the thing that seems to perfect our soul is virtue, arete, excellence. And how do we get that? We get that by following God, which is the happy life. And so in the pursuit of virtue, the soul's following after something. And what it's following after, basically, is either a wise person or God. Well, a wise person can be taken away from us. And here Augustine's probably thinking about when Plato lost Socrates. Okay, he didn't want to lose him, but he lost him nonetheless. God remains, and Augustine says, if we follow after God, we live well. If we reach God, we live both well and happily. The second thing I ask you to read is the Enchiridion, not the Enchiladodon, as it sometimes looks like. Enchiridion means like a handbook or a manual or a guide or instructions, and I never read those anyway, but sometimes this is also called Faith, Hope, and Love. And we know a couple of things about this. We know that it was written for a guy named Laurentius, because it says, Dear Laurentius, and we know that it was written just after the death of St. Jerome, because it mentions that. St. Jerome's the guy who translated the Bible into Latin, creating what's called the Vulgate, because it's used vulgar or common Latin, in about 420 AD. So this is towards the end of Augustine's life, and it's kind of an instruction or a catechism on how to be a good Christian. And so the alternate title of this is Faith, Hope, and Love, and those are those Pauline virtues. They come from Corinthians. If you've ever been to a wedding, I'm sure you've heard them. So under faith, there he's talking about using the Apostles' Creed. That's the I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, blah, blah, blah. He says that's a good way to teach things and refute heresies. Under hope, he says, here's how to pray. And he goes through the Lord's Prayer, the Our Father. He says this is a model of Christian prayer. It's perfect. The final part is a discourse on Christian love. And the word they use is agape or caritas, where our words charity and caring come from. Okay. So he says the supremely good creator, being God, having made all things good, the Trinity is supremely, equally, and unchangeably good. The constituent parts, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, are good even when taken separately, but taken together, they're very good. Grammar Nazis, prepare to cringe. They are more gooder. They are the most goodestest. So therefore, all good things come from God. But evil, if it's regulated and put in place, really enhances our appreciation of the good. So, I don't know, if you have a kind of marginal, crappy McDonald's hamburger, and then you go get a perfectly medium rare seared filet mignon, that hamburger is going to make the filet even better by comparison. Vices in our soul, what we might call sin, they're privations of natural good. We're being deprived of it. It's being taken from us. And when they're cured, they're not transferred elsewhere. When they cease to exist in the healthy soul, they can't exist anywhere either. Now, where's he going with this? It says, all of us were made good, but we're not perfectly good. Only God is. We're liable to corruption, so we can become bad. Everything that exists, seeing the Creator is good, are themselves good, but because we're not supremely and unchangeably good, our good can be diminished and increased. Think Aristotle's teeter-totter, where sometimes we go towards a vice of excess, sometimes towards a vice of defect. For good to be diminished is an evil, obviously, but some good, he says, has to remain to constitute the being. And he means this quite literally. So Augustine might tell us that, you know, Hitler's left pinky toenail was still a good part, and so he was still around for a little while. Because the good which makes it a being can't be destroyed without destroying the being itself. Now, as long as we're in this process of corruption, you know, we're trying to become good. Every being is good, a great good if it can't be corrupted. So those good people that we think about, those exemplars of virtue, they're very good. We're only a little good if we can be corrupted. And you and I probably can be a little bit corrupted depending on the issue. If we're ever wholly consumed by the corruption, then the corruption itself ceases to exist because there's nothing left in for which it to dwell. So two examples of this, and I'm going to fly my geek flag pretty high here. You start out, you've got Senator Palpatine, nice guy, Ian McDiarmid. He starts to get a little bit Sithy. He gets all scarred up. He becomes Emperor Palpatine. He electrocutes Luke, and then Darth Vader throws him down into the main reactor of the Death Star. He literally ceases to exist. Example 1. Example 2, you got Smeagol. Heck of a nice guy, out there on a little Hobbit fishing trip. He finds the Ring of Doom, starts to really degenerate in his physical appearance, traipses around with Frodo and Sam, and then literally falls into the fires of Mount Doom, completely ceasing to exist. So these are geeky examples of Augustinian philosophy in Star Wars and The Lord of the Rings. You're welcome. Okay, let us now turn our attention to Thomas Aquinas, who was summa kind of wonderful. Okay, tough room. Now, Aquinas and Augustine lived another 800 years apart. So we have just gone from last week to now 1600 years, and we're kind of bookending the last of our classical and medieval era. So Aquinas is going to show up in the 1200s. Okay, between that period is the Dark Ages, is the fall of Rome, is the moving of the center of civilization really over to the Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople, which today is known by some as Istanbul. And during this time, Islam had held a lot of that knowledge. So pardon me. So as Islam expands, they are going to come across the part of the world that had the Eastern Roman Empire. They're going to be exposed to Greek mathematics, Greek music, Greek philosophy, Greek history, all this kind of stuff. And at the time Aquinas shows up, both the Muslims have gone across the north of Africa and across the Strait of Gibraltar into what is today Portugal and Spain, but also the Crusades have taken place where Christians are going to the Holy Land, Jerusalem, and they're encountering Muslims there and fighting them, but oddly getting along sometimes. So all of this information is now flooding back into Europe that had been gone so long, they had no idea that they'd lost it. So the 11th century, we really see this kind of flowering of culture, which blossomed in the 12th and really bloomed in the 13th, which is when Thomas shows up. So it's a cool time to be around. He was born in Italy to a noble family. His father was the Count of Aquino, hence his name, Aquinas. Mother was the Countess of Teano. Doesn't want anything to do with them though. Runs away, joins the order of friars preachers, which are known as the Dominicans. Studies under Albertus Magnus, which was kind of a big thing back then. He studies and teaches at the University of Paris, and then eventually writes 17 volumes of philosophy and theology. And these aren't little volumes, these are great big volumes. Eventually, he's canonized as a saint by the Roman Catholic Church. So what Aquinas is trying to do, what he really wants to accomplish, is to combine the philosophy of Aristotle with the theology of the Roman Catholic Church. And most of his writings, especially some that we're going to talk about here, become the basis of almost all subsequent Roman Catholic theology. So he's going to appeal both to Roman Catholic Christian tradition, but also the thought of Aristotle. So our first key concept with Aquinas is the end. And this we would have called a teleological disposition. Remember, end, aim, plan, goal, design, outcome, and so on. Everything aims at some end. For us, as intelligent or rational agents, we act for the sake of ends that we intend. So we have intentionality. But even the actions of entities without reason, natural agents, so my German Shepherd sitting right outside the door here, are directed to their natural ends through their instincts. Okay? The good connects ends with what's good. He says, look, every agent, rational agents, irrational agents, act for the sake of some good. Rational agents, that's us, we determine our ends under an aspect of the good. That is, we desire and pursue ends that we think are good. Since God is the supreme good, all things by extension are pointed at God as their final end. And then he introduces two things that are going to be kind of interesting for us and that we're going to be seeing a lot of comparisons to in the coming weeks. He says the eternal law, that's the unchanging standard of conduct that's based in reason, okay? So that's the stuff that God wants us to do, or not to do, as the case may be. The natural law, that's the rational creature, us, our participation in the eternal law. By that he means these are kind of the self-evident principles. If I feel, I shouldn't kill if I can avoid it, or I shouldn't steal if I can avoid it, well then that's my understanding of what God wants for me to do or not do. So the first thing I ask you to read is called Summa Contra Gentiles. And this is kind of translated as like the book of the truth of the Catholic faith against the infidels, the unbelievers, whomever you group into that. And he's interested here in God as he is perfect in being and causing, so is he perfect in ruling. And because we're interested in the good and ends as objects of our will, whatever proceeds from a will has to be directed at some end. Now, that is going to be towards God. And we're either acting by nature or by intelligence. Okay? Now, he's going to tell us, very similar to what Aristotle said, that the good of the nation is more godlike than the good of one man. Okay? Remember, Aristotle said to do good for one person is a source of satisfaction, but to do good for entire nations and for states is nobler and more divine. Through the rest of Summa Contra Gentiles, he's going to tell us that man's happiness is not in wealth, not in worldly power, not in goods of the body, not seated in the senses, but ultimately in contemplating God. Remember, Aristotle told us that the highest thing that we are able to do is contemplate things, to use our intellect, to be those rational animals. And so man's ultimate happiness, Aquinas is going to go a little further here, is not in this life. So we're not even doing this for now. We're doing this to prepare for later. In Summa Theologica, which means like highest theology, which is an absolutely huge book, really we only need to go through a couple of things with this, and then we'll wrap this up. The format of it is really unique. So he's going to write 394 numbered questions, each one getting a little more specific. So think of a big funnel of information kind of coming down and coalescing at one point. So what he's going to do is he's going to take objections to the position that he's going to defend. And the reason he's doing the objections first is if you and I are discussing something and you're presenting objections and I told you, yes, I've already covered that, and yes, I've already covered that, it really kind of takes the wind out of the sails of your particular argument. He's then going to state what he takes to be the correct position. And this is where he's going to appeal to authority, usually Augustine himself, possibly Aristotle, who he called the philosopher, or the Muslim commentator from whom he borrowed this format, Averroes, who he just calls the commentator. And then finally, he's going to develop and explain his own idea by giving replies to those initial objections. Now, this is an absolutely huge book. So to give you a concept of just how big it is, here is my copy of it. And I mean, it's no slouch. Let's see. It's weighing in at over 1,500 pages. This version's written all in Latin. So it's a big one, okay? Not recommended for bathroom reading, your legs would fall asleep. The whole idea of this is that it's cyclical. And really what we're interested in is it gives the single best definition of law ever committed to paper. No matter what you think of religion, no matter what you think of Aquinas, this is a brilliant definition of law. So here it is. This is one of those things you'd want to write down. An ordinance of reason for the common good made by him who has care of the community and promulgated. Well, let's break that down. So it's an ordinance, it's a guideline, it's a directive. Literally, ordinals are directing you which way to go, of reason. Why reason? Well, to the exclusion of passion and emotion. What's it intended to do? Well, it's for the common good. It's to make things a little better for all of us. Who made it? Well, whoever has care of the community. And then promulgated. Promulgated is just a fancy word for saying introduced into practice or made, the standard by which we all act, okay? Now, here's what makes this a brilliant definition of law. It is perfectly scalable. And what I mean by that is if we're talking about the community as the entire universe, well, then the person who has the care of it is God. If we're talking about a country, it's your president, your prince, your potentate, your whatever. If we're talking about a state, it's your governor. If you're talking about your locality, it's your mayor. If you're talking about a household, it's whoever the head of the household is. And if we're talking about you as an individual, it should be your rationality. We don't have to change the definition to make it fit from you through every level of that all the way up to God. And that's pretty darn tricky to do. And that's really going to be the biggest takeaway from Aquinas. Especially, I want you to pay close attention when next week Hobbes is going to give us a very different, kind of dark definition of law. And so really what we get with Aquinas is a very good picture of we're not interested in the religious aspect, so to speak. we're getting a picture of what is happening with Aristotle during the High Middle Ages, so during the 13th century. What does Aristotelian philosophy look like? And one of the reasons we want to do that is because it is going to be such a clear break-off next week as we enter the early modern era and things change significantly. So that's all I've got for you tonight. As always, if you've got questions, go ahead and post them down in the comments or over in the discussions on Canvas, and I will look forward to seeing you next week. Hope you're all well, and I'll see you later. Bye-bye.